April 8th, 1943. High above the clouds of occupied France, the morning sunlight cut through the icy blue sky like a blade. 27,000 feet below Europe burned. But up here inside the cockpit of his Focke-Wulf, 190A5 Oberleutnant Ralph Hermchen was smiling. The oxygen mask pressed tight against his face couldn't hide the smirk forming underneath. Through the crystal-clear canopy, he watched the new American fighters laboring upward, heavy and awkward, struggling for altitude. Their silhouettes were massive, almost absurd, thick-bodied machines dragging themselves toward the fight. He keyed his radio, unable to suppress a chuckle. "Die Army has sent us flying milk bottles," he mocked to his wingman. Laughter echoed over the comms. Below them, 16 P-47C Thunderbolts from the U.S. 4th Fighter Group clawed through the air in formation. Each of their 2,000 horsepower Pratt and Whitney double Wasp engines strained against nearly 7 tons of weight. Their propellers looked enormous, their wings too small, their bellies swollen with machinery. To the German pilots of Jagdgeschwader, 26 veterans who had danced through the skies of Britain and Russia, these American machines were a joke. Sleek Messerschmitts and nimble Focke-Wulfs ruled the sky. These fat newcomers didn't belong here. Hermchen and his men circled like wolves, confident, almost entertained. None of them knew that what they were seeing, those clumsy shapes rising toward them, would one day become the most feared sight in the European sky. For within those barrel-shaped fuselages were 8 synchronized Browning, 50 caliber machine guns, and 3,400 rounds of destruction waiting to speak. The laughter of that morning would soon vanish, replaced by terror and disbelief. Because in less than 2 years, the flying milk bottles would become angels of thunder, the very weapon that shattered the Luftwaffe's pride and buried its legacy in a storm of lead. The P-47 Thunderbolt was born not from confidence, but from fear. In June 1940, as Nazi fighters swept across France and British skies burned, an urgent order arrived at Republic Aviation. The U.S. Army Air Corps demanded a new interceptor, something that could meet the Luftwaffe head-on at high altitude. Alexander Kartveli, a Georgian-born designer working in New York, read the specifications and shook his head. "They want a miracle," he muttered to his engineers. What he created instead was a monster. "It will be a dinosaur," Kartveli admitted, but a dinosaur with good proportions. When the XP-47B prototype first flew on May 6, 1,941 witnesses couldn't believe their eyes. It looked too big, too heavy, too complicated to fly. At 9,900 pounds empty, it was 65% heavier than its predecessor, the P-43 Lancer. A maze of turbo-supercharger ducts twisted through its fuselage, giving it a bloated, almost pregnant appearance. Test pilots who approached it for the first time would glance at each other and whisper, "This thing actually flies." But it did fly, and once airborne, it broke every rule. The heart of the beast was the Pratt & Whitney R2800, double Wasp engine, 18 cylinders, 2,000 horsepower, a mechanical symphony of metal and fire. Where other engines gasped for oxygen in the thin air above 25,000 feet, the Thunderbolt's turbo supercharger kept it roaring with sea-level strength. Yet this brute was not easily tamed. At Bridgeport, Connecticut, the 56th Fighter Group, led by Major Hubert Hub Zemke, began training with the new fighter in late 1942. The results were disastrous. In only 4 months, they lost 18 pilots and 41 aircraft. The P-47 seemed cursed. It ground-looped on landing, torque-rolled on takeoff, and dove so fast that the controls froze solid in the thin air. Pilots whispered that it killed more Americans in training than Germans would in combat. But those who survived long enough to understand it began to see something different, something extraordinary. Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson, a young Oklahoma farm boy who would one day become one of America's top aces, remembered his first flight vividly. "It was like strapping yourself to a locomotive," he said. "You didn't fly it, you aimed it." The power was intoxicating. Once you learned to respect it, the aircraft didn't just climb it charged. It didn't merely dive it plunge like a meteor. And in its wings waited 8 machine guns capable of turning steel into dust. Still, by early 1943, the Thunderbolt remained untested in real combat. Many in the RAF quietly doubted the Americans' choice. "A flying barn door," one British pilot joked. The best evasive maneuver is to unstrap and run around inside the cockpit. They didn't know it yet, but the laughter once again was about to end. April 1943. The sky above northern France shimmered with sunlight and contrails. Below 56 American pilots of the 4th and 56th Fighter Groups flew their first missions in Europe, untested, uneasy, and facing the most experienced air force in the world. The Luftwaffe's aces had fought across Poland, France, Britain, and Russia. They were predators honed by years of war. The Americans, in contrast, were rookies, their flight suits still smelling of new fabric, their Thunderbolts gleaming like factory-fresh steel giants. Major Donald Blakesley, commanding officer of the 335th Fighter Squadron, was one of the few who understood what was coming. A veteran of the RAF's Eagle Squadron, he knew the old rules of dogfighting no longer applied. "Forget turning fights," he told his men. "You don't dance with the enemy in a Thunderbolt, you crush him." But the first engagements were humiliating. The P-47 seconds could not turn with the nimble Focke-Wulf 190 seconds or climb with the Messerschmitt 109 seconds. German pilots slashed through their formations like hawks among lumbering crows. Oberst Joseph Pips Priller of JG-26 reported gleefully after one such encounter, "The new American fighter is meat for the slaughter. It flies like a truck, turns like a freight train, and climbs like a pregnant cow." Laughter echoed across German airfields once again. They called the Thunderbolt der Blechschwein the Tin Pig. The first month's numbers seemed to prove them right. 14 Thunderbolts lost for only 3 confirmed German kills. British observers shook their heads, murmuring that perhaps the Americans had built the wrong kind of machine for the war in Europe. But something peculiar was happening, something German intelligence failed to notice. The P-47 seconds that did fall had taken impossible amounts of punishment before going down. One Thunderbolt limped home on May 4th, riddled with 21 cannon holes and more than 100 machine gun strikes damage that would have torn a Spitfire or Messerschmitt to pieces. Yet the big American fighter's radial engine with no vulnerable coolant system kept spinning. Its wings, thick, overbuilt, and ugly, stayed firm. And when the P-47 seconds did manage to bring their 8 Browning machine guns to bear, the results were devastating. A 2-second burst unleashed 6,000 rounds per minute, a solid wall of metal that could saw an enemy fighter in half. The laughter in the Luftwaffe's ready rooms began to fade into silence. Then on June 26, 1943, the world learned just how indestructible this flying milk bottle really was. June 26, 1943. Over the skies of Lisieux, France, the air shimmered with sunlight and gunfire. Second Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson of the 61st Fighter Squadron, that same Oklahoma farm boy who once said the Thunderbolt felt like a locomotive, found himself at the edge of hell. His formation of 48 P-47 seconds had just finished escort duty for American bombers when 16 Focke-Wulf 190 seconds pounced from the sun. Veterans of Jagdgeschwader 26, led by Wilhelm Ferdinand Galland, the younger brother of the famous Luftwaffe ace Adolf Galland. The Germans executed a perfect ambush. Johnson's Thunderbolt, flying near the rear, was hit first. 20mm shells smashed into his aircraft in the opening seconds. His canopy shattered. The engine cowling was ripped apart. Hydraulic fluid sprayed across the cockpit like blood. Fire burst behind his instrument panel. Johnson, bleeding from shrapnel wounds to his nose and leg, tried to eject, but the canopy wouldn't move. A 20mm shell had jammed it shut. He was trapped inside a burning coffin 2,700 feet above France. Smoke filled the cockpit. Flames licked the instrument panel. Johnson's gloved hands trembled as he reached for anything, any switch, any handle, but there was nothing. The canopy refused to budge. He realized with a cold clarity that he was going to die, but the Thunderbolt refused. Despite the smoke, despite the torn fuselage and the oil-smeared windscreen, the engine still roared. It coughed, sputtered, then steadied as if the machine itself refused to surrender. Johnson pulled back on the stick. The controls were sluggish, almost frozen, but the aircraft leveled. He pointed the nose toward the English Channel. He couldn't see the horizon, just black smoke, oil, and fire. But somehow, impossibly, the P-47 flew. Then a shadow appeared behind him, another Focke-Wulf 190. The German pilot, identity forever lost to history, slid into position behind Johnson's crippled fighter and opened fire. Cannon shells tore through the wings, machine guns hammered the fuselage. The Thunderbolt shuddered violently, metal shrieking like a wounded animal. Johnson could only crouch behind the armor plate, praying. The German fired until his cannons clicked empty, then switched to machine guns strafing again and again. Finally, he pulled alongside, staring at the wreck that should have been falling from the sky. Through the smoke, Johnson could see his face, young, blonde, handsome, twisting from triumph to disbelief. The Focke-Wulf pilot shook his head, saluted, and banked away out of ammunition and out of comprehension. Robert S. Johnson's P-47 somehow made it home. It crash-landed at Manston Airfield, engine dying on the runway. His crew stopped counting bullet holes after reaching 200. The canopy was welded shut by shell fire. 3 of the aircraft's 4 main structural beams had been blown through, and still it had flown. The incident stunned both air forces. American engineers studied the wreckage in awe. German intelligence dismissed it as a myth until their own pilots confirmed the story. The message was clear: the fat American fighter wasn't a joke anymore. It was indestructible. By July 1943, the laughter was gone. The same German pilots who once mocked the P-47 as a pregnant cow now spoke of it with unease. Reports filtered through Luftwaffe headquarters describing an enemy fighter that refused to die, a machine that could take the punishment of 3 aircraft and still return to base. American pilots were learning fast. Hub Zemke, commander of the 56th Fighter Group, the very man who had once despised the Thunderbolt, had finally discovered its secret. Don't fight like a Spitfire. Fight like a Thunderbolt. Don't turn with them, he told his men. Don't climb with them. Use your weight. Use your dive. Use your guns. The P-47's size, once its greatest liability, became its deadliest weapon. Its massive frame made it the fastest diving aircraft in the sky. From 3,000 feet, a Thunderbolt could hit 550 miles per hour faster than any German fighter could dream of, even in a vertical dive. Out of these new tactics came a revolution in air combat. Captain Walker Bud Mahurin of the 56th Fighter Group developed what pilots would soon call the Thunderbolt turkey shoot. Instead of engaging in tight-turning dogfights, P-47 squadrons climbed high, higher than German planes could operate effectively, and waited. When the Luftwaffe appeared below, the Thunderbolts rolled inverted and dove. At the bottom of the dive, they unleashed all 8 Browning 50 caliber machine guns in a thunderous roar that German pilots described as a wall of lead. Those caught in that wall didn't simply fall, they vanished. The sheer concentration of firepower disintegrated aircraft midair, tearing wings and tails apart in an instant. Survivors spoke of their comrades' fighters turning to metal dust under the relentless storm. Then came August 17th, 1943, the day the world witnessed American firepower in its purest form. On that morning, hundreds of B-17 bombers roared toward Schweinfurt and Regensburg, deep inside Germany, striking at the heart of the Reich's industry. Major David Schilling and his flight of Thunderbolts were their guardians. As a formation of twin-engine Messerschmitt Bf 110 seconds, heavy fighters armed to slaughter bombers moved in for the kill. Schilling's P-47 second struck first. From nearly 2,800 feet, the Thunderbolts dove like hammers from heaven. Heinrich Roth, a surviving German gunner, later recalled in a POW interrogation. The Americans came down so fast that we barely had time to turn. I fired first good hits, but the P-47 didn't even flinch. Then he fired. The aircraft ahead of us just came apart, wings, tail, everything. Gone in 2 seconds. In less than a minute 8, Messerschmitt 110 seconds were obliterated. Each P-47 carried 425 rounds per gun, 400 inches total. At a convergence distance of 300 yards, those bullets met in a 6-foot wide sphere of annihilation. Within that space, nothing survived. The Germans began calling them Donnerschlag, thunderclap. The P-47's thunder was no longer laughter. It was fear. By late 1943, the skies over Europe had changed. The Luftwaffe still ruled the headlines, but not the heavens. At high altitudes where the air thinned and engines gasped for breath, the Thunderbolt thrived. Its massive turbo-supercharged double Wasp engine delivered full power at 3,000 feet, while German fighters struggled and stalled. Up there, the air no longer belonged to the sleek Messerschmitts or the elegant Focke-Wulfs. It belonged to the brute that could climb like a storm cloud and dive like a falling comet. The proof came on October 8th, 1943. Oberleutnant Hans Philipp, one of Germany's most decorated aces, with over 200 victories, led his squadron to intercept American bombers over Bremen. At 2,8000 feet, his Focke-Wulf 190 wheezed in the thin air, its BMW engine starving for oxygen. Then the Thunderbolts fell upon them. From 3,2000 feet, Robert S. Johnson and his wingmen dove with terrifying speed. Johnson saw Phillips' distinctive nose art and squeezed the trigger at 300 yards. Tracers streaked across the sky, striking the German ace's fuselage from tail to propeller. The fighter exploded in midair, no parachute, no trace. Phillips' death sent shockwaves through the Luftwaffe. If their best couldn't survive, what chance did the rest have? A report to Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring in November 1943 spelled out the grim truth. The Thunderbolt possesses superior speed in dive and climb, extreme structural strength, heavy armor, and devastating firepower. Engagement above 2,5000 feet is inadvisable. But the Americans were only getting started. In early 1944, a new version of the beast arrived, the P-47D-22, fitted with a 13-foot paddle blade propeller that bit the air like a cleaver. Its climb rate jumped from 2,200 to 3,000 feet per minute, matching or even exceeding the best German fighters. And that sound, oh, that sound. German troops on the ground would later say they could hear the Thunderbolts before they saw them, a deep rolling roar that shook the earth. They called it Donnerschlag, the thunderclap of death. By March 1944, P-47 seconds, fitted with external tanks, could escort bombers deep into Germany. Their range extended to over 1,000 miles. They were everywhere above Berlin, over Hanover, along the Rhine, looming shapes in the sun that spelled ruin for anything below. The Luftwaffe tried to adapt. It didn't matter. The Thunderbolt's heavy armor shrugged off hits. Its firepower shredded everything in its path. Its pilots, now seasoned veterans, had turned it into a weapon of unstoppable precision. Then came June 6th, 1944 D-Day. 500 Thunderbolts roared across Normandy's dawn, sky-blanketing the invasion beaches in a fortress of noise and flame. German pilots who dared to rise were cut down in seconds. Oberleutnant Wolfgang Fischer of JG-2 remembered the horror. "We tried to break through at dawn. 12 of us. I was the only one who returned. The sky belonged to the Americans. You couldn't climb over them. You couldn't dive under them. Their guns turned us into aluminum rain." By the end of June, Thunderbolts of the 9th Air Force had obliterated 651 locomotives, 3847 trucks, 512 tanks, and over 4500 horse-drawn vehicles. The Wehrmacht supply lines disintegrated under relentless attack. Daylight movement became suicide. German soldiers began calling the P-47 seconds, Jabo's fighter bombers, but the nickname didn't capture their terror. These were flying artillery batteries, reaping destruction with terrifying precision. They had once been laughed at. Now, their very sound sent men diving for cover. By the summer of 1944, the Thunderbolt had become more than a fighter. It was a symbol of inevitability. The Luftwaffe's pilots, once the hunters of Europe, were now the hunted. Every sunrise brought the same sound, the low, menacing rumble of Pratt and Whitney engines echoing across the fields of France, warning that thunder was coming. As the Allies pushed inland from Normandy, the P-47 became the hammer of the ground war. Its 8 50 caliber machine guns ripped through convoys and armored columns with terrifying ease. A 2-second burst delivered 160 half-inch projectiles into a target area the size of a truck. Nothing survived that, but even that wasn't enough. By late 1944, Thunderbolts carried bombs and rockets, transforming from air superiority fighters into flying battleships. The D-25 variant could haul 2 1,000-pound bombs under its wings and a 500-pounder beneath its fuselage, the same payload as an early war medium bomber. Later versions added racks for 10 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets, HVARs, each equal in power to a 105mm artillery shell. German troops learned to fear the screaming descent of those rockets more than any artillery barrage. Oberst Hans von Luck, commanding the 125th Panzer Grenadier Regiment during the Normandy campaign, remembered the first time his men faced a Thunderbolt strike. They came in low, so low you could see the pilots' faces. The sound was unbearable. Engines roaring, rockets shrieking, machine guns hammering. In seconds, 20 trucks vanished in flame. A whole column turned to wreckage. We called them jabos, but that word was too small. They were monsters, flying artillery with perfect aim. By now, the Thunderbolt's transformation was complete. The clumsy giant, once mocked by every Luftwaffe ace, had become the angel of destruction that ruled both sky and earth. And the German pilots knew it. Major Gunther Rahl, one of the Luftwaffe's top aces, with 275 victories, barely survived an encounter on March 6, 1944. He later recalled in a post-war interview, "We saw them above us, fat silhouettes against the sun. Someone joked, 'Here come the flying pigs.' 30 seconds later, nobody was laughing. They came down like an avalanche. One passed, 3 of our fighters gone. Their guns didn't chatter, they roared a solid stream of fire. If you were caught in that, you died instantly." Even the dreaded 88mm flat guns, Germany's most feared weapon, struggled to stop them. The Thunderbolt's speed and armor made it almost untouchable. Ground crews began painting their helmets with American stars, hoping superstitiously it might make the Thunderbolt spare them. By autumn, the P-47 was everywhere, above bridges, rail yards, convoys, tanks, a constant shadow in the daylight. The Wehrmacht could only move at night. The roads that had once thundered with German power now burned under American fire. And while Europe trembled under the roar of the Thunderbolt across the Pacific, another storm was brewing, one that would prove the P-47's power knew no ocean, no limit, no mercy. While the P-47 was devastating Europe, another war, wilder, hotter, and infinitely vast, was raging across the Pacific. Here, amid endless blue oceans and jungles that devoured men and machines alike, the Thunderbolt proved it was more than a European brawler. It was a survivor built for punishment, distance, and destruction. In late 1943, the 348th Fighter Group arrived in New Guinea under the command of Colonel Neil E. Kirby, a daring pilot with fire in his eyes. Many believed the P-47 was too heavy, too slow for the Pacific's agile Japanese fighters. Kirby disagreed. On October 11, 1943, he led 4 Thunderbolts against 40 Japanese aircraft over Wewak. They climbed into the blazing tropical sun, 4 silver behemoths against a swarm of Zeros. By the time Kirby landed, he had personally shot down 6 enemy planes, earning the Medal of Honor and the eternal respect of every man who saw it. The Japanese were stunned. Accustomed to fighting nimble but fragile American fighters like the P-40 or P-39, they had never encountered anything like the Thunderbolt. Their 20mm cannons, so lethal against light aircraft, barely scratched its thick armor. Japanese ace Saburo Sakai, one of the most respected Zero pilots of the war, later wrote of his first encounter with the P-47. "We called them monsters. Our cannons, which could destroy a P-40 with a few hits, seemed useless. I put dozens of rounds into one Thunderbolt and watched it fly away. Their return fire was terrifying, a solid stream of heavy bullets that turned our aircraft into confetti. Even in the brutal heat of the Pacific, the Thunderbolt thrived. It was rugged, powerful, and relentless, the perfect companion for long-range strikes across island chains, where engines failed, fuel ran dry, and men vanished without a trace." The later P-47 Newton's variant, designed specifically for Pacific operations, pushed the limits of flight endurance. With wet wings holding 93 gallons each and external drop tanks, it could travel more than 2,300 miles without stopping. It escorted B-29 superfortresses to Japan and back, proving that the once short-legged Thunderbolt had become a global predator. By 1945, P-47 seconds were sweeping across the Philippines, Iwo Jima and Okinawa, blasting Japanese airfields, convoys, and shipping lanes into ruin. Their reputation grew to myth. To Allied ground troops, they were guardian angels. To the enemy, they were the sound of doom. And then, as Europe collapsed and Japan bled, a new threat appeared, one faster, deadlier, and unlike anything the world had ever seen: the jet. By late 1944, Germany was desperate. Its skies, once patrolled by proud aces and gleaming Focke-Wulfs, were now haunted by the roar of Thunderbolts. Factories lay in ruins, fuel was scarce, and young recruits were sent into combat with barely 50 hours of flight time. But then the Reich unveiled its last gamble, a weapon of the future. The Messerschmitt Me 262, the world's first operational jet fighter. It was sleek, silver, and terrifyingly fast, capable of more than 540 miles per hour. On paper, it should have rendered the propeller-driven P-47 obsolete, but the men flying Thunderbolts had never learned to surrender to paper odds. November 27th, 1944 high above Germany. Lieutenant Colonel John C. Meyer of the 352nd Fighter Group spotted the impossible, a jet flashing across the sky like a comet. The Me-262 streaked past his formation, confident in its speed, but Meyer rolled his P-47 inverted and dove. From 28,000 feet, gravity became his engine. The Thunderbolt howled downward air, screaming over its wings as the speedometer climbed past 480, 490, 500 miles per hour. The jet pilot below never saw him coming. At 400 yards, Meyer squeezed the trigger. 8 Browning, 50 caliber guns unleashed their full fury tracers, slicing the sky, finding the fragile jet. The Me-262 exploded in a blinding flash, its twin engines spiraling away like burning stars. In his after-action report, Meyer wrote calmly, "The enemy aircraft disintegrated under fire. Both engines separated from the fuselage. The pilot did not escape. The future had met the past, and the past had won." Soon after, the U.S. introduced the P-47MA, Thunderbolt built to chase jets. With refined aerodynamics, a water methanol injection system, and 2,800 horsepower, it could reach 470 miles per hour fast enough to intercept Me 262 seconds during takeoff or landing. Major George Bostwick of the 63rd Fighter Squadron shot down 2 jets in March 1945. His tactical summary was simple. They're faster, yes, but they can't turn and they can't take punishment. One burst from our guns and they come apart like paper. The last gasp of the Luftwaffe came on January 1st, 1945 during Operation Bodenplatte, a massive surprise attack by 900 German fighters on Allied airfields across Belgium and the Netherlands. At Y-34 airfield near Metz, the 365th Fighter Group's P-47 seconds were caught on the ground. Explosions lit up the sky. 22 Thunderbolts were destroyed before they could even take off. A captured German pilot, grinning, pointed at the burning wrecks and sneered. "What do you think of that?" Major George Brooking looked him straight in the eye and replied, "By tomorrow we'll have 40 new ones. How long will it take you to replace your pilots?" The German smirk vanished. Within 48 hours, brand new Thunderbolts filled the flight line. The Luftwaffe lost 271 aircraft and 213 pilots that day, men they could never replace. America lost 134 planes and replaced every one within a week. The numbers told the truth. The sky no longer belonged to Germany. By 1945, the roar of the Thunderbolt had become the soundtrack of Germany's defeat. Factories that once built Messerschmitts stood silent, their roofs blown apart. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of Europe, existed only on paper. Fuel was gone, airfields were craters, and the few surviving pilots faced a sky they no longer controlled. Yet, the Thunderbolt flew on, tireless and unstoppable. It wasn't just a plane anymore. It was the embodiment of industrial power, the living proof that the war had become one of endurance, not elegance. At its peak, Republic Aviation produced 1 Thunderbolt every hour. 2 massive plants, Farmingdale, New York, and Evansville, Indiana, pounded out nearly 500 aircraft per month by 1944. Each P-47D was a masterpiece of mass production. 65000 individual parts, 8 miles of electrical wiring, and an engine with 2 400 precision machined components. The numbers were staggering. 15683 Thunderbolts built. Over 213,000 combat sorties flown. More than 135 million rounds of 50 caliber ammunition fired. 120,000 tons of bombs dropped. And in return, a kill ratio of 4.6 to 1, the highest of any Allied fighter bomber. Behind these statistics lay a deeper truth. Every aircraft, every bullet, every pilot represented a nation that had learned to turn its factories into an army. By war's end, the Thunderbolt had destroyed over 7,000 German aircraft, 9,000 locomotives, 6,000 armored vehicles, and tens of thousands of trucks and trains. The Luftwaffe's backbone, its fuel, its transport, its replacement was obliterated. Captured German reports told the story in cold bureaucratic clarity. April 1943. Large, unmaneuverable, minimal threat. December 1943. Exceptional at altitude, increasingly dangerous. June 1944. Dominant fighter bomber, firepower devastating. March 1945. Best fighter bomber of the war, engagement inadvisable at all altitudes. When the fighting finally stopped, the silence was deafening. At a 1985 reunion in Phoenix, former Luftwaffe General Adolf Galland was asked about the P-47. He smiled a weary, knowing smile. "We laughed at it in 1943, he said. "We called it a bomber pretending to be a fighter. We were wrong. The Americans didn't build a European fighter, they built an American one. Big, brutal, over-engineered, and unstoppable. They built them faster than we could build graves for our pilots." That's when I knew the war was lost. He paused, remembering the sound that haunted every German pilot, the deep thunder of 8 synchronized Brownings. "We called it Roosevelt's piano," Galland said softly. "Once you heard that music, you never forgot it." In the end, the Thunderbolt didn't just defeat the Luftwaffe, it buried it under an avalanche of steel, fire, and willpower. The ungainly, overweight flying milk bottle that once drew laughter had become the very storm that ended an empire's reign in the sky. When the thunder spoke, no one laughed again.